We're talking American history, more specifically, Black political American history. We're going to get into it. Let's get it. Welcome. First of all, welcome. This is Unsolicited Perspectives. I'm your host, Bruce Anthony, here to lead the conversation in important events and topics that are shaping today's society. Join the conversation and follow us wherever you get your audio podcast. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for our video podcast, YouTube exclusive content, and our YouTube membership. Rate, review, like, comment, share. Share with your friends, share with your family, hell, even share with your enemies. On today's episode, I'll be interviewing Dr. Marion Orr, author of the book House of Diggs. It's about Charles C. Diggs Jr., an important Black political figure in America's history that's been forgotten. But we're going to get into it. But that's enough of the intro. Let's get to the show. My guest is Dr. Marion Orr, the inaugural Frederick Lippitt Professor of Public Policy at Brown University and one of the leading voices of race, urban politics, and Black leadership in America. His new book, House of Diggs, is the first full biography of Congressman Charles C. Diggs Jr., Michigan's first Black member of Congress, a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus, and behind-the-scenes force in the civil rights movement. Diggs was the first there at the trial of Emmett Till's killers, worked along Dr. Martin Luther King, and helped spark the anti-apartheid movement in the U.S. But his legacy is too often been overshadowed by a scandal that ended his career. Dr. Orr's work uncovers not just the rise and fall of this powerful figure, but also what Diggs' story tells us about race, justice, leadership in America today. So without further ado, here is Dr. Orr. As I said at the top, I'm here with Professor Dr. Marion Orr, the author of House of Diggs, as well as a Terp graduate, got his PhD at the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Orr, I am so grateful to have you on the show today because we're going to be talking about your book and your life. And we're going to be talking about a person that's very, very important, not only in politics, but also in Black politics and Black history. So thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Bruce, for having me. I'm very excited about being on your show.
Is it because we're Terp alum?
Yes.
All right, so let's jump right into it. You built a remarkable career studying Black political leadership and urban politics. But before we dive into your book, I love to start with you. That's how I start all my interviews, to get a little bit of background on you. What was your upbringing like? And what experience led you to study the intersection of race, politics, and power in America?
Well, my upbringing was a working class upbringing. I'm from Savannah, Georgia, born and raised in Savannah. And my mom and dad were good working class folk. In fact, my daddy could not read nor write. They got married very young and had 3 children. But I'm with the youngest of their three.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was born and raised in Savannah. And I suspect I got interested in government and politics around high school. I was pulled into my civic classes and history classes. Bruce, when I was in high school, ABC News hired the Black journalist Max Robinson. Max Robinson was the first Black man to anchor a national news program, ABC Nightly News.
Uh-huh. He anchored it.
That's right. He co-anchored.
Mm-hmm.
And Lester Holt was one that recently was the anchor NBC, but way back in the late 70s, ABC hired Max Robinson, a Black broadcast journalist. And that thing so impressed me that I would run home every weekday evening to watch Max Robinson read the news from around the world and from the U.S. And I've become somewhat convinced that watching Mr. Robinson each evening piqued my interest in government and politics. As I said, I excelled in civics and history in my high school, and I got involved in local things in Savannah.
Mm.
I helped some people run for city council when I was in high school, and I went to college also, Bruce, in Savannah. I'm a graduate of an HBCU called Savannah State University.
Mm-hmm.
It was called Savannah State College when I was there. And so, real quickly, at Savannah State, we had on the faculty perhaps one of the country's most brilliant political scientists, a man named Haynes Walton. Haynes, like the T-shirt
Mm-hmm.
company Haynes, and his last name is Walton. Your viewers might want to Google Haynes Walton Jr. He was at Savannah State from 1967 to 1992
Mm.
before he got lured away to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Haynes Walton was a political scientist who taught Black politics. He, in fact, helped create the subfield that we now have in political science that we now call Black politics. It was Professor Walton who really, in the late 60s, early 70s, began to write about Black politics and Black American politics. In fact, he published and wrote the first in the field textbook on Black politics.
Wow.
And I had the wonderful opportunity to work with Dr. Walton since I was 18 years old when I first met him until he died about 10 years ago.
Mm.
And Walton took me under his wing, and I wanted to be just like Professor Walton when I was a young man. He published a lot of books, and as I said, literally created the subfield of Black politics. So I attribute it in large part to my interest here, the question you raised, to my early interest in high school, and having the real blessing to connect with Professor Walton at Savannah State, and he became my mentor and friend. And I wouldn't be here talking to you if it had not been for Dr. Walton and the other professors at Savannah State. So yeah.
So it seems like what you're saying to me is one, representation. You saw representation. You saw somebody that looked like you on the nightly news. And because you saw somebody that looked like you at the nightly news, you were paying attention to what he was saying, and what he was saying and what he was talking about piqued your interest. And then when you get in college, you have a mentor that you revere, and it skyrockets. Is
Yeah.
that the basic?
That's
So
it. That's it in a nutshell.
right.
Yes.
So you said your parents, or at least your father, could barely read, and you're the youngest of three siblings. How was education pushed in your household? Because I know my grandfather was only able to finish high school to 10th grade before he had to go out and start working to help support the family. And then he raised three children, two of which has their masters, all of them have their bachelor's degree, because education was so very important. And then the education trickled down. So I'm just want to ask you, in your household, how important was it as a foundation that started from your parents and then your older siblings?
Yeah. Well, it was stress. Let me just say, I'm the only one of the three to go who have gone and finished college.
Oh.
Yeah. In fact, my daddy used to say that he had one son who would not stop going to school. That's me, because I got my BA, my master's, and my PhD. And then he would tell his friends he had two who would not go to school at all. So I was really just lucky to. You hit it right when you said representation.
Mhm.
When I walked on that campus at age 17 at Savannah State, Bruce, and met those professors, those Black professors out there, man, they
Mhm.
blew me away.
Yeah.
They really did. They were leaders in the Savannah community. Many
Mhm.
of them were on the school board, city council, various commissions. Growing up in a working class almost poor community. I knew where they lived. They lived in some of the best neighborhoods in Savannah for Black people, I should add. So I knew where they lived. So they just so impressed me when I was, and it was, I'll tell you this, I was 18 years old when I went home and told mom and dad I wanted to be a political science professor.
Mm.
Those people out there on that campus just really blew me away. They were very impressive. They were very smart. They care for their students. People like me who probably didn't have the strongest background, but they nurtured us. They cared for us. They wanted us to succeed. And for me, it was just a wonderful experience to be on that campus. And I was out there 5 years because I had to work and pay my way through college. My mom and dad couldn't afford to do that. So I had to work at night to get through Savannah State. But the bottom line is those professors were so impressive. They were very smart. And I was 17 years old, and I was like, my goodness, these people are just really something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be just like them.
Okay.
And so that's really what happened. I tell you no lie. And they were all, at the black colleges, Bruce, everybody is called Dr. So-and-so, in the big white schools, people call their first name, but at Savannah State and Morehouse, Hampton, everybody who was a faculty member is referred to as Dr. So-and-so. Even your colleague call you Dr. So-and-so. And as a young 17-year-old, watching those black people out there being called Dr. this and Dr. that, I was like, my God, I could be Dr. too, That's how it happened. I tell you no lie.
And you did. And you became a doctor at the greatest institution, the University of Maryland, College Park.
Yes. So I was really blessed. Let me just say this is strong sort of recognition of the role that HBCUs have played and continue to play in our country.
Yes, absolutely. So I love to tell the people how I'm a historian, how I have my history degree from the University of Maryland. And I love to tell the story that I didn't learn about the Tulsa Massacre. And I had I went to 3 different high schools. One of them was a private school. I had a really good high school education. But I did not learn about the Tulsa Massacre until I took an African-American history class at the University of Maryland.
Right, sure.
I'm interviewing you because you wrote a book about a man that I actually had heard nothing about, but he is so vital and so important in not just American history, but Black history as well. What first drew you to Charles C. Diggs Jr.? And was the moment that you discovered what was the moment that you discovered this is a story that I want to tell?
Well, I discovered Congressman Diggs at Savannah State College in Professor Walton's classes, and Walton taught many of the courses at Savannah State because there's no huge faculty, so he's doing a lot of teaching, you see, and a lot of research and publishing. He was a remarkable man. He taught a lot, taught well, and he also got books published. Charles Diggs came up frequently in many of the courses that Professor Walton taught. If it was on Congress, he came up because Charles Diggs was the founder of the Congressional Black Caucus. If Professor Walton was teaching a course on city politics, Diggs would come up because Professor Walton would tell us about Washington, D.C. and how unique D.C. was compared to other cities because Congress controls Washington, D.C., and he would explain to us about home rule that Diggs helped develop in Washington, D.C. Professor Walton taught a course called African Politics. It's the only course I ever had on African politics, quite frankly. And in that course, Charles Diggs came up. And not as some sort of fly-by-night person, but a serious leader, a substantial player in Professor Walton's courses. So I learned about Diggs as an undergrad at Savannah State College. I'll go on to graduate school to study political science, Bruce, and I still learn more about Diggs and his contributions. And so after graduate school, And going through the tenure process, I just realized that no one had published or written a book on this person who I understood to be quite substantial. I discovered that he had left his papers at Howard University,
Mm-hmm.
at the archives there. And once I discovered that, I began to think, well, maybe I should write this book. And about almost 10, 11 years ago, I set out to write the first biography of Charles C. Diggs Jr. And in this book, Bruce, I document that Diggs was the most consequential Black person ever to serve in the United States Congress. So that's the origin of the book. It started way back as an undergrad when I learned about his contributions at Savannah State College.
And I'm going to cut the audience off before they even start to think it, because we're going to get into the contributions of Mr. Diggs. But everybody's going to say, well, didn't Obama serve in Congress? Yes, and he did become president. However, when you understand everything that Charles Diggs did, you'll realize, yeah, no, this isn't hyperbolic. Dr. Orr is absolutely right. Diggs is the most important Black person to ever serve in Congress. But you said something that I know my listeners here, because I'm here in the DC area and I have a lot of listeners and watchers here in the DC area. You said something about house rule. This is the first time I'm actually hearing about that. Can you describe what Mr. Diggs came up with the house rule in Congress?
No, a home rule.
Home rule, excuse me, home rule.
Yeah, home rule. Yes. Home rule for Washington, D.C. Should
Mm-hmm.
I explain that to your
Yes,
listeners now?
please.
Oh,
Please.
sure. And I learned this in Professor Walton's class when he talked about city politics. He would always make the point that DC is different. How is it different? Well, it's a city of 750,000 people, just about, but it's a city that is a seat of the national government. It is the seat of our federal government. And if you read our Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, it makes very clear that the Congress has, quote, exclusive, unquote, control over the federal district, which is Washington, D.C. And so, Bruce, many people don't know this. But listen, for about 100 years, the President of the United States appointed the local officials in Washington, D.C. That's right. The president appointed the mayor, the president appointed the city council members, and other high ranking officials in the District of Columbia. That was not always the case. Here's the quick story. After the Civil War, prior to the Civil War, you had what was called local democracy there. That is, the Congress and the president allowed local officials to be elected in the District of Columbia until the Civil War. When the Civil War came, more Black people moved to the district. They became free and became able to vote. And so during Reconstruction, you began to see Blacks gaining power and influence in the DC government. And this would be a problem for many whites. And so what would happen is they would take away local democracy from DC following Reconstruction. And the bottom line is that Congress did not want Black people, Black Americans, to run the federal district. And so for 100 years, they stripped home rule away and allowed the president and other federal officials to appoint local officials for DC. And it would not be until 1973, through the efforts of Charles Diggs Jr., that home rule would be restored in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
And as you probably know, your listeners probably know, that home rule currently is under attack by the Republicans in Congress and Donald J. Trump, the president of the United States. So
Yeah.
home rule right now is really under serious attack. In fact, the Republican platform, the party platform, makes very clear that they would like to strip home rule away from the voters in the District of Columbia.
Wow. Yeah, I knew
Yeah, man.
something. I knew something like that was going on. I did not know this was part of the platform, but it actually makes sense.
Yeah, it's in there. It's in their platform. Your listeners and viewers can go read their 2024 platform. They want to wrestle control away from local officials in the district.
So that's one example of Charles Diggs' importance in not only American politics, but also Black politics. But
Mhm.
let's go all the way back to when he was elected to be a representative. And there was a major event that happened in this country that kind of woke people up and might have been the catalyst for white Americans to really see why the civil rights movement was so important. And that's the murder of Emmett Till. Now he pops up at the trial of the two people that murdered Emmett Till. And it was fascinating learning about this because, once again, I knew nothing about this, but you go into detail about this in your book. Can you explain just how important it was for him to go there and really be the only representative from Congress to be there, correct?
This is true. The only member of the federal government to sit there in the trial. Diggs, as you said, Bruce, was elected in 1954, November of 54. He goes to Congress, takes the oath of office in January of 1955. In the summer of 1955, there's an important trial taking place in a small town called Sumner, Mississippi. And as you indicated, two white men were on trial down in Mississippi for the murder, the lynching of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old black boy from Chicago who went to Mississippi in the summer of 55 to visit his relatives there, and he was murdered for apparently whistling at a white woman or something just to this effect. Anyway, Congressman Diggs, who just arrived in office, he was 32 years old, very young, relatively speaking, he decided that he would go down to Mississippi and sit in the courtroom and observe the trial of these two white men who allegedly murdered Emmett Till. Let me quickly add that after the trial, they confessed to the killing of Emmett Till.
Mm-hmm.
Diggs' presence at the trial had a number of important factors that make his presence so significant down there. Number one, the black witnesses who saw the murder take place were frightened to death because this is Mississippi in 1955.
Mm-hmm.
And any black person who accused a white man of murdering a black person, their life was threatened. Okay? So these witnesses were really frightened about what they had witnessed and the fact that they were being now asked to come forward and publicly testify at the trial and to accuse these two men of doing this. So Biggs' presence in the courtroom gave the black witnesses the courage, the stamina, the support they needed to go through with their testimony. And I know this because the witnesses are quoted as saying after the trial that seeing the black congressman in the courtroom gave them the courage. Seeing the black congressman with power and influence gave them the courage to come forward. So He had an impact on the Black witnesses who were frightened to death. Let me just add that Diggs, working with another Congress member, William Dawson of Chicago, had to work and arrange for those witnesses to leave Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they had to leave because they knew that they would not be able to survive. They would have been killed. And so Diggs helped arrange for the witnesses after their testimony to find a new life in Chicago.
Mm.
So a big impact on the witnesses. And here's the other factor that impact he had, Bruce, that your viewers should know about. Diggs' presence, and you're right, he was the only federal official in the courtroom at the trial. Diggs' presence as a newly elected Black member of Congress, I argue, elevated the media interest in the trial.
Mm.
His being down there, having the courage to go down there. Let me just say that he wrote, Diggs later wrote about his experience down there during those 5 days. He wrote a series of essays for the Pittsburgh Courier describing the 5 days he was down there.
Mm-hmm.
And he says very clearly that he was frightened.
They didn't allow him to, they forced him to still, even though he is a elected official, a congressman, they still forced him to fall in line with the Jim Crow laws. And I think I read somewhere that he wasn't even allowed, he had to sit where Black reporters were sitting.
Yeah, this is true. The courtroom was segregated, and the sheriff made it very clear that he said to Diggs, I don't care if you're a congressman or not, you're going to observe the segregation policies we have here in Sumner, Mississippi. And so he, like the others, had to sit in a segregated section of the courthouse. In fact, they weren't going to let him in the courthouse at all at first. He had to the sheriff initially blocked him from coming into the courthouse. It was only after Diggs got word to the judge that the judge allowed him to come in, and the sheriff would sit him, as you said, in the Jim Crow section of the courthouse. So Diggs' presence there was very significant. And let me just say this: Diggs going down to Mississippi just a few months after taking the oath of office was also sending a signal to America about the role he planned to play as a new member of Congress. Diggs was saying right out of the box that I plan to be a Congress member for all of Black America. That I know Detroit sent me here. I know I represent the 13th Congressional District of Michigan, but I am going to be a leader, a spokesperson, a representative for all of Black America. And when you look at his record after, his moving forward, you can see that is simply what he set out to do. He became, one of the strongest voices in civil rights in this country, and he would go on in Congress to do a lot of amazing things.
Well, let's talk about some of the stuff that he did in civil rights and in Congress, because he worked with Dr. Martin Luther the King. That's what I call him, Dr. Martin Luther the King. And he also was a founding member and chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. When you look at his political career, what do you think is the most defining moment for him when it states of him being a leader?
Well, if someone would push me on this, on his legacy as such, it would have to be Africa. It would have to be Southern Africa.
Okay. Because he was banned from South Africa, correct?
Yeah. And here's why I say this. When Diggs was elected in 1954, this is after the Brown v. Board decision. He got elected in November. Brown was, I think, in May. Okay. Harry Truman has already moved toward desegregating the military and other efforts. You could see, Bruce, that our country was moving, so ever slowly, toward incorporating blacks into the political system and to our system, generally speaking, with the civil rights laws being passed. So my point is, Biggs was a major civil rights leader, but I could suggest to you that some of the things he worked on was sort of moving in the right direction toward desegregation, for example, if you will. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Africa was different,
Hmm.
okay? Especially Southern Africa. When you look at the record, it's very clear that had it not been for Congressman Diggs using his position in Congress as chair of the Africa subcommittee, that it was Diggs who was the one who pushed and pushed and pushed until this country recognized that it had to sever its ties from the racist apartheid regime in Southern Africa. And my point is this: unlike civil rights in America, where you can see maybe the nation moving in the right direction from Brown, from Harry Truman to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you don't see this in Southern Africa.
Hmm.
Democratic presidents, Republican presidents, all were aligned with the South African regime. And they all were trying to work with the South African regime, largely because of the Cold War imperative. South Africa was strongly anti-communist, you see.
Hmm.
So my point is this: I don't think our country would have moved in the direction away from South Africa had it not been from the pressure that Charles Diggs helped bring about in this country in the 70s, 80s, and eventually in the 1990s. So if I were pushed on this, I would say clearly his efforts in Africa and particularly South Africa were just monumental. And it was clear that he had a role in literally changing our policy. Listen, man, I found letters in the Nixon papers where President Nixon was trying to pull us closer to South Africa. Okay? Gerald Ford was trying to pull us closer to South Africa. Reagan was not someone who was, trying to pull us away from South Africa. So my point is, Diggs' work in this area was so critical because it really reoriented our national policy towards Southern Africa.
So, with the research you did for the book, uncovering FBI files, conducting interviews with families and colleagues, and digging into the archives, obviously going through the stuff at Howard, did you know about his importance of fighting apartheid beforehand, or was this something that as you did the research for the book, you kind of honed in on and said, yes, he is very, very important in American history and Black political history, extremely important.
Yes, he is.
But this is what's the most important thing. And was that discovered during the research?
It came upon reflection. It came upon reflection. Just as I just said, when you think about the arc of the movement in this country in terms of civil rights, clearly Dr. King and Congressman Diggs played a big role. But when you look at Africa, in particular Southern Africa, Diggs was trying to loosen the bonds between the two countries when Republicans in Congress, Southern Democrats in Congress, and the White House was trying to strengthen the bond. So for me, it's sort of upon reflection, I say, wow, when you look at this guy, he was really somewhat radical on the issue of South Africa in terms of pushing our country away from the racist regime. Bruce, very few people knew about apartheid. And Diggs was talking about apartheid in the late 50s, early 60s, and the 1970s. So he was the person who really galvanized this nation around an anti-apartheid movement. And I lay out in the book how he facilitated that by helping create the organization that became known as Trans Africa. So he was
Mm.
phenomenal in this particular area. And that's why I think if I would push, I would say it's his work in South Africa that was so vital and so critical.
Yeah, because what you're describing is a 25 to 30-year fight.
That's right.
Yeah, I
Yes.
mean, yeah, okay. So you brought up Nixon, and Nixon actually had a list, an enemies list, not unlike our current president, but we're not going to get into that. But Nixon had an enemy list, and Mr. Diggs was on this enemy list.
Yes.
Now, I'm not going to make the correlation that this is what led to the scandal and imprisonment, but I will say that it happened not too long after Nixon put him on the list.
Yeah.
So can we talk about a little bit, because I think this is the reason why he doesn't get talked about a lot in history, is because of the scandal and going to prison, but he's maintained his innocence. He maintained his innocence until the end of his life, correct?
Yeah, he did. Although, if you read the trial transcripts, and I read every 1,200 page of it, it's pretty clear that he violated congressional payroll rules at the time. Let me just say this: you mentioned Nixon and the enemies list. You see, Diggs was the founder of the Congressional Black Caucus. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to underscore this because a lot of folks talk about the 13 founding members. Okay. And there were 13 founding members, of which Diggs was one of them. But everybody can't be the founder. Okay. Let me make that very clear. All right. Okay. All
Okay.
right. And so when you read my book, House of Diggs, I lay out very clearly how Charles Diggs became the individual to help create what became who created what became the Congressional Black Caucus. In the Diggs papers at Howard University, I discovered a letter. Bruce, a fascinating, it really took me away. A letter from John H. Johnson Jr., who was the founder of Jet Magazine and Ebony Magazine, Johnson Publishing Company.
Mm-hmm.
Your listeners may have heard of these before, viewers. In 1957, John Johnson writes to three Black Congress members, Adam Clayton Powell from New York,
Mm-hmm.
William Dawson from Chicago, and Charles Diggs from Detroit. Johnson writes these three Congress members, and what he does is suggest that they should form a, quote, Negro caucus, unquote. That he was suggesting that the three of them should come together and form a caucus, a group among themselves, so they can sort of coalesce in solidarity and work together.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Well, when you dig through the archives, here's what you find. Adam Clayton Powell wrote a dismissive note to Johnson's idea. Powell essentially was his own man. You know, he didn't believe in working together. So he quickly dismissed Johnson's idea about a Negro caucus. Bill Dawson, the Black member from Chicago, was very conservative on race issues. He stayed away from race issues. Okay, so in the archives, there's no response from from Bill Dawson. I guess Bill Dawson probably simply ignored Johnson's idea. Okay, so Powell dismisses it. Dawson ignores it, but Congressman Diggs takes the time to respond, and he wrote a very thoughtful letter to Johnson on his idea of forming a Negro caucus. And essentially, what the young Congress member said was that great idea. However, there's only three of us. Perhaps once we grow the numbers, more Blacks in the House, perhaps then we might consider forming a caucus. Okay? And so a few years later, Diggs would take this up.
Mm.
He would take Johnson's idea and implement it, forming in 1969 a group that he called the Democratic Select Committee. And
Mm.
what Diggs did was he began to have informal meetings with the now 6 people who were in the House, because you had Adam Clayton Powell, Dawson, Diggs. In 1958, Robert Nix came in from Philadelphia. In 1962, Augusta Hawkins came in from California. And in 1964, John Conyers joined Diggs as the second Black member from Detroit. So now you have, 7 or 8 members. And Diggs would pull those people together informally, and they would meet. And in 1969, he would solidify that group into an organization he called the Democratic Select Committee. Because in 1969, you had 3 more members come in: Stokes from Ohio, Shirley Chisholm from Brooklyn, and Bill Clay from Missouri. And so Diggs formed the Democratic Select Committee, and then, Bruce, in 1971, the Democratic Select Committee became the Congressional Black Caucus. This is why I say Diggs was the founder of the caucus. Okay, he was one of 13 founding members, but it was really Diggs who acted on John H. Johnson's 1957 proposal.
So,
And it would be the Congressional Black Caucus push toward Nixon that would lead Diggs and other CBC members being on Nixon's enemies list.
which is funny because I thought I read somewhere that at one point before the Nixon Kennedy election, that Nixon and Martin Luther King were actually friends.
Yes. You're right. Nixon was the vice president in Eisenhower's administration,
Right.
and he was considered a moderate on civil rights issues. He was the person in the administration that civil rights leaders could talk to on civil rights matters. And what happened is that Nixon will run for. He lost the race against John F. Kennedy.
Well, he didn't lose. That's the one election. 2020 wasn't a stolen election. But that John Kennedy election, because family is from Illinois, from Chicago. I can
the
say
machine. Okay, the Democratic machine gave the race to JFK. That's what you're going to tell me.
Okay, that and some mafia folks, but they that's the reason why Nixon was a little bitter, because they stole that election from him.
Yeah.
But go ahead, continue.
And so he ran in 1960, and he ran a somewhat moderate race on campaign on civil rights. But when he ran again in 1968, Nixon took a much more right-wing conservative position on civil rights, on welfare, and all these kind of issues. And he literally sort of flipped the strip, if you will. And instead of being a more moderate person on race, he became much more conservative and would use welfare reform and civil rights as a effort to hurt the Democratic Party.
Now, the audience is going to be upset. They're going to be upset because we touched on a nugget and we left a cliffhanger. And I thought that he was framed, but you're confirming Mr. Diggs did actually break the law, and the prison sentence and conviction was legitimate.
Yeah, let me lay this out very clearly here. Diggs got involved in a payroll kickback scheme. He increased his secretary's salary and the increased salary came to Diggs, was given to Diggs to help pay his bills. The
Mhm.
congressman, and this is not an excuse, I'm just explaining what happened to him. The congressman got into serious financial problems,
Mhm.
and he decided the one way to get out of this financial problem is to be involved in this payroll kickback scheme.
Mhm.
Let me just add that other members of Congress have been involved in similar kinds of practices. It was just as well known. I laid out in the book that other members of Congress were doing this. Some got in trouble.
Mhm.
Some like Diggs got convicted and sent to prison. So Diggs maintained his innocence, yet when he was on trial, the jury of 11 blacks and one white, most of the 11 blacks were women,
Mhm.
convicted Diggs of all 29 of the charges that he was brought against him.
Huh.
He had a very weak defense.
Mhm.
He simply came to trial and said that the secretary voluntarily
Oh
allowed
boy.
him to take the salary. So so what Diggs would argue was that he was selectively prosecuted.
Mm.
That because he was an African American, a black man, that the Justice Department decided to take him throughout all the way to trial and could convict him. But if you read the book, I lay out what happened to Congressman Diggs, and it's a sad story, but it happened, but it doesn't diminish the impact Diggs had on this country and in Africa. It impacts him personally.
Mhm.
It really did.
Yeah.
But in terms of his historical contributions, his his conviction of the payroll kickback scheme, I think is just evidence of his imperfectness and the frailties and weaknesses that all of us have as complex human beings.
Yeah, it just sounds like he's just human. Human.
Well, he got it. Well, the deal was this. Again, it's not an excuse, just explaining it. He got in financial trouble, and being a powerful Congress member, he had access. He saw opportunity to sort of get this money, and he took it.
Yeah.
And he shouldn't have, obviously.
Yeah. If you look at today's generation of black politicians, from Congressional Black Caucus to city mayors to grassroots leaders, where do you still see Diggs's fingerprints? What parts of the political DNA still live on in today's society?
Well, when I look at the current almost 60 over 60 members of the Congressional Black Caucus, I see Diggs' legacy.
Mm.
The group that at once was just 13 members has now grown to 62 members. And the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, is, I think, without question, one of the most powerful black political organizations in the nation. When I look and see Congressman Gregory Meeks from New York, is currently the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Mhm.
If the Democrats become the majority, he will become chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And he's a black man. Diggs was the first black person to ever serve on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So when I see Gregory Meeks,
Mm.
and when the Democrats were in charge, he at one point was the chair. I see Diggs. His legacy is just so phenomenal. Listen, when I get on the airplane and fly, and I see black flight attendants and black pilots, I think about the efforts of Charlie Diggs in the 1950s and the 1960s to open up commercial air travel and employment to black Americans.
Hmm.
Okay? I see Diggs. I don't fly anymore and not consider Diggs when I get on the airplane now, you see. because of Charlie Diggs. When I look out and I see Muriel Bowser, the mayor of Washington D.C., in the Oval Office next to Donald Trump, I see Diggs in his role as bringing home rule and representation democracy to Washington D.C. Okay, so his legacy is just phenomenal.
Mhm. Oh, I gotta ask this because you said Marion Bowser, and there's I live here, so she's made some decisions that
Oh yeah,
Um,
she's in a tough man. She's in a tough spot.
she
In a
is.
tough spot because I just told you and your viewers that Congress has exclusive control over the District of Columbia.
Yeah.
Okay, she's in a tight spot, man. But go ahead.
Well, it's called now the Congressional Black Caucus, but originally it was you said the name of the group had Democratic in it.
Democratic Select Committee, yes.
Democratic Select Committee. Throughout the history of the Congressional Black Caucus, have there been Black Republicans? Because Byron Donalds isn't in the Congressional Black Caucus, is he?
Yeah. Historically, the Republicans, Black Republicans, have not really been involved in the CBC.
Mm-hmm.
When the CBC was formed, Bruce, there was a Black U.S. Congressman from Massachusetts, a
Okay.
Republican. His name was Edward Brooks. Okay, he was a Black man. He was in the U.S. Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And Senator Brooks was not a part of the Congressional Black Caucus. If he were, it would have been one of 14 founding members. Okay? So
Mm-hmm.
historically, the Black Republicans have steered away from the CBC because the CBC has historically been largely a Democratic organization represented by Democratic members. So no, people like the guy from Florida you mentioned would not be a part of the caucus in large part because they don't align with some of the policy issues that the caucus stand for. Yeah.
Mm. To kind of go away from the political aspect of Mr. Diggs, was there something that you discovered about Diggs, the man, not the congressman, not the activist, that helped you understand his motivations, his flaws, or his humanity in a deeper way?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I would say is that Diggs got along with almost everybody.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. I talked to many of his colleagues who served with him, and they liked him a lot. So he had the kind of demeanor and whereby he was able to work with a broad range of people. He was by nature a coalition builder.
Mm.
That's the other thing that I sort of came away from, sort of opening my eyes. And here's a guy who really had the capacity to build coalitions. The Congressional Black Caucus, in a way, is a coalition of Black
Mm-hmm.
members of Congress. Trans Africa, which played a big role in creating a coalition of activists interested in bringing down the apartheid regime, working with civil rights leaders outside of Congress. He was very, very keen on linking up with entities and organizations outside of Congress so that those folk can put pressure on Congress from the outside. So one of the things I guess taken away and learning about this man is just the extent to which his demeanor and the way he carried himself attracted people to him. People really liked working with him. And you can't say that about everybody who serves in Congress. Let me just add that a lot of people could not work with Adam Clayton Powell.
Mm.
Many of the leaders of the Black organizations talked about Powell as being unreliable, out for himself. So when it was time to connect with a Congress member, they were more likely to call Diggs than Adam Clayton Powell because Diggs was a reliable, serious, policy-oriented Congress member. There's no question about that.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about Mr. Diggs' life. You have detailed so much about his life and career in your book, House of Diggs. What do you want not only the readers of your book, but the audience of the show to walk away with thinking, not just about his work, but about the story of Black political struggle and the progress in America?
Yeah. The House of Diggs, this biography I've written on Congressman Diggs, really gives the reader a close-up view of many of the important events in our nation around civil rights from 1955 to 1980. You're sitting there looking at what's happening with the Emmett Till situation. You're there he's there working with Dr. King around passage of the 64 Civil Rights Act, passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Diggs, we didn't mention this, but Diggs was a veteran of World War II. So going through Diggs, you can see the challenges that Black military men, discrimination they faced during World War II. And then, of course, you get to see the movement, the civil rights movement in this country spread not only here in this country, but to Southern Africa, where Blacks now in the 80s and 90s are mobilizing to help in Southern Africa. So what you see through the life of Diggs is a gentleman who's key in many of these major historical periods in Black American life. So you get a close-up look at American political life from the 1950s until his resignation from Congress in 1980.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Marion Orr, author of The House of Diggs, and once again, a graduate from the University of Maryland College Park.
Right. Go Terrapins.
That's right. Dr. Orr, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and giving us a lesson, not only in American history, not only in Black history, not only in American politics, but also in Black politics and African politics.
Yes.
I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and enlightening us and engaging in this very great conversation and helping us grow knowledge about more of this country than we knew before.
Well, thank you, Bruce, for having me on. I really enjoyed it. You asked some really, really great questions. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. You know, I like to give myself a little pat on the back. That's that University of Maryland education.
Yeah, you did good. Thank you, sir. Thanks
Thank
again
you.
for you and your audience for listening.
It was my pleasure. Man, that was a hell of a conversation. And like I said, I'm a historian. Man, I knew nothing about Charles Diggs. Nothing. I'm actually kind of embarrassed to interview Dr. Orr and to do the research before the interview and to learn about Charles Diggs and to be a historian where my wheelhouse is literally World War II to the Clinton years. That's my bag. And to not know who Charles Diggs is an indictment, not only on me, right, as a historian, an indictment of our education system, not only middle school, high school, but also in college. It's an indictment of us as Americans to not know how consequential Mr. Diggs was in American history. Dr. Orr's work reminds us that history isn't just a set of names in a textbook. It's a living map of how we got here. Charles Diggs wasn't perfect. None of our heroes are. But he was bold enough to challenge the system from the inside when the inside wasn't built for him. He stood at the crossroads of civil rights and political power. And his story forces us to ask, What do we owe to those who opened the doors we now walk through? If you want to dig deeper into that question, and I really think you should, go pick up Dr. Orr's new book, House of Diggs, The Rise and Fall of America's Most Consequential Black Congressman. It's not just about one man's journey. It's about the cost and courage of leadership in America. I want to thank Dr. Orr for his time, for his scholarship, and for bringing Charles Diggs' story back into the national conversation. And for everyone listening, I want you to stay curious, I want you to stay honest, and I want you to keep asking those questions that sometimes won't ever get asked, and search for the answers to the questions that don't get asked, but that need to be asked. Charles Diggs is an important figure that should not be forgotten, and I feel it's the work of Dr. Orr, as well as Bruce Anthony, the host of Unsolicited Perspectives, to make sure that he is remembered and celebrated for all the work that he's done. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for watching. And until next time, as always, I'll holla. Woo, that was a hell of a show. Thank you for rocking with us here on Unsolicited Perspectives with Bruce Anthony. Now, before you go, don't forget to follow, subscribe, like, comment, and share our podcast wherever you're listening or watching it to it. Pass it along to your friends. If you enjoy it, that means the people that you rock will enjoy it also. So share the wealth, share the knowledge, share the noise. And for all those people that say, well, I don't have a YouTube. If you have a Gmail account, you have a YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can actually watch our video podcast and YouTube exclusive content. But the real party is on our Patreon page, After Hours Uncensored and Talking Straight-ish. After Hours Uncensored is another show with my sister. And once again, the key word there is uncensored. Those are exclusively on our Patreon page. Jump onto our website at unsolicitedperspectives.com for all things us. That's where you can get all of our audio, video, our blogs, and even buy our merch. And if you really feel generous and want to help us out, you can donate on our donations page. Donations go strictly to improving our software and hardware so we can keep giving you guys good content that you can clearly listen to and that you can clearly see. So any donation would be appreciative. Most importantly, I want to say thank you for listening and watching and supporting us. And I'll catch you next time. Audi 5000. Peace.